Broadcasting now. All right, Mark, you're live on Zoom and Facebook. You're good to go.
Okay. Just gonna give it 1 minute, everybody. All right, so we're going to begin, everyone. Welcome back to day 3, week 3 of the Permission to Feel Book Club. Glad to see everybody joined. I was contemplating whether or not to keep this night just because it's the eve of a holiday weekend, but figure the Permission to Feel group is willing to keep going. So we decided to be consistent and keep it every week. So tonight's goal is to do a couple of things. One is just do a little bit of review because I got some questions from everyone around the mood meter and some things that people wanted to know more about the mood meter. Then we're going to dive into chapters 4 and 5. We're going to really focus on chapter 4 today on emotion perception, and both from the self-awareness perspective as well as from the other awareness perspective, meaning how do we interpret and read other people's feeling states. And I have a guest who you'll get to meet in a little while. His name is Matt LaPalme, and Matt is a researcher in our center who studies emotion perception and has been the lead investigator on our assessments to build tools to measure emotion perception. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that. And then we may have time for another guest and then also more Q&A. All right, sound good? I hope it does because that's what we're doing. So I'm gonna share my slides. And as always, you know, we like people to learn about these things. So if you're into Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, please share your ideas and your takeaways from today. And we're going to jump right into that mood meter again. So last week, we talked a little bit about the mood meter, but tonight what I want to do is go a little bit deeper with all of you and kind of help you think about how the tool is used for building greater self-awareness. So as I've said before, the x-axis is pleasantness. I'd like you to think about this as a kind of a core experience. You wake up in the morning, you're not really waking up saying to yourself, I feel elated, I feel optimistic, I feel down or disappointed. We wake up with kind of this appraisal of our day, of our moment. And we say things like, you know, I kind of feel like approaching the day. I kind of don't feel like approaching the day. That's what that x-axis is really about. The y-axis is kind of also working in the same way, but it's about our energy. So we're checking in, do I feel like I can thrive? Or do I feel like I just, you know, want to stay in bed because I'm so kind of depleted of my resources? And what scientists call these dimensions are core affect. It's your core affective experience. So let's try it right now. Where are you this evening, July 2nd, 2020, before a 3-day weekend? -5. Psychologically, you're like, avoid, avoid, avoid. +5. Somewhere in the middle. What is your body signals? Do you feel energized or do you feel depleted? And we always start off with the quadrant, right? Because it's hard to take the complexities of our inner experience and just go right to the feeling word oftentimes. What happens is that we tend to go into the quadrant first. So let's do that now. What quadrant are you in right now, everybody? And we're going to use the Q&A, not the Q&A, we're going to use the chat box. So what color are you in today? We got yellows and greens and blues. Okay, it's interesting. We don't have a lot of red. So looks like the anger and anxiety family is not as predominant right now. Or maybe I've primed you to feel that way. A little bit of green. Okay. So let's take a minute and think about that. You know, you're here, you wake up, you're in a meeting, you're in a webinar talking about emotional intelligence, and you get this kind of gut experience, like kind of in the blue, or I'm green, or I'm in yellow. The way ruler works is that the second step is trying to ask yourself the questions. So, like, what's happening? Why am I feeling that way? That's chapter 5, the understanding piece. We're trying to make meaning out of our experience. So, like, I said I'm in the yellow, but like, what the heck is going on for me right now? Why would I be in the yellow right now? And you start thinking, oh, I'm about to do the book club. I'm excited. Or I'm about to do the book club. I'm freaking out. Or I'm about to do the book club. It's not going to work out. Or I'm about to do the book club. Oh, that's a nice way to end the week. So take a moment and think about why you chose your color tonight. What's the reason? What's happening for you? You don't have to share this publicly, by the way. And as you think about the cause, can you then label your feeling? So what's the word? What's the feeling word that's associated with your experience? So I see grateful, I see drained, apprehensive for something that's about to happen, curious, content. Nice. So think about ruler as our model of emotional intelligence. And the R and the U and the L are all about making meaning of our experience. And they work together. So the R for self-awareness is that core experience. Am I pleasant? Am I unpleasant? And am I energized? Am I depleted? The U is saying, okay, what's going on? Why am I feeling this way? Like, oh, I'm about to do this, or I just heard that news. I'm feeling excited, apprehensive, disappointed, content. That's the process of R, U, and L. Now, the same thing applies interpersonally. Think about it. When we walk into a room, when we go down for breakfast in the morning, when we're in a meeting at work, we walk into a meeting and we're doing that scan. Think about that, right? We do that scan of the environment and we're like, how many of you, give me a thumbs up, have ever walked into a meeting and you're like, I'm not really welcome here? Has anyone ever had that experience? You know, it's like you feel it. And it's your kind of gut appraisal, not of yourself necessarily, but of your environment. And then the question is, you know, what are the feelings of the group or the individual that you're working with? So remember, this work is all about self-awareness and about interpersonal awareness, or being perceptive of other people's feelings. One last thing, that a good question came in by someone named William. And he said, is every time that you plot yourself on the mood meter, an emotion, a mood, or a feeling, the things that we talked about last week? And the answer is no. Sometimes you are plotting just a physical state. I'm guilty of this. And this is the way the brain operates, so it's kind of interesting. Let me explain. So like many of you, I'm a workaholic. And oftentimes I'm sitting with my partner on the couch, we're watching the news and I'm typing emails and I'm like, I'm overwhelmed. And then he'll say something like, are you sure? And I'm like, yes. And then he says something like, well, it's like 11 o'clock. You've been working since 7 o'clock this morning. I'm like, yeah, you're kind of right. Maybe I'm just freaking exhausted. And so my point here is that our brains are built to make predictions. So we start analyzing our thoughts and we start analyzing our physical states. And then when it's in that place of like shakiness, like I am typically by the time it's 11 o'clock and I'm still doing my freaking emails, we start trying to make meaning out of that experience. And we say, well, in previous times, you know, when my body's this way, I'm having these thoughts, that means anxiety. That means overwhelmed. And then we start labeling a physical state as an emotion. And then we start worrying, oh my God, I'm anxious, I'm overwhelmed. When the truth is you just might be freaking tired. So take a moment and, you know, over the next couple of weeks and try to get this granularity, like that nuance in your self-awareness. Not everything is a feeling or an emotion. Sometimes you're just tired or hungry, right? The same thing applies, you know, to food. So we're going to leave that there right now. Maybe I can take a few questions. Any questions? You guys have opportunities to take some, write some points. Any questions about these nuances? So a lot of people are asking about tracking your moods. Actually, that was another question by a woman named Karen. And so let me address that right now. If you only use like our Mood Meter app tool, when you are like feeling a strong emotion, then you are biasing your plots. You're biasing your mood tracking. So in the app, or if you don't use the app, and you can just give yourself a reminder and use a piece of paper. But for example, for the app, what I recommend is that you do either like multiple times a day. So you track like morning at breakfast, maybe late morning or lunchtime, afternoon, you know, as soon as you get home, in the evening, if you really want to make like a real meaningful experience. And then what you can do is when you look at your plots across day and time, you can start get more meaning out of like your actual experiences, your actual feelings, you know, time of day, location, or day of week. So that's a really important thing to do, is don't just plot when you're feeling like I'm pissed, right? You want to do this in a more like routine way, so that you can kind of build greater understanding about how you're feeling at different points of the day or week. Other questions? Is there a simple mood meter for kids? Yes, you can use the same mood meter tool for kids. You just don't get into the details of the lines and the numbers. You just teach them what yellow means. As young as 3-year-old children can understand the 4 quadrants of the mood meter. So don't underestimate. It can be done. I'm seeing some other questions come in. Yeah, so someone's asking about the differentiation of emotion and feeling. Not that important in terms of everyday kind of self-awareness. It's more, you know, if you want to be an emotion scientist and get to the details of the nuances of a feeling, is kind of a response to an emotion. The emotion is more episodic, you know, has different components, but honestly, not that important. Feelings, emotions, I would just call them experiences, and kind of leave it at that. It's called the Mood Meter app for the person who asked. So a lot of questions are around this idea of multiple feelings. So the best example I have of this is many years ago I was in a school that was serving children who had learning differences, and some had, you know, emotional difficulties. And this is talking about mindsets and the way people kind of perceive children. So anyhow, let me get to the story, which was that the boy, I was doing a model lesson, and then I said to this kid, he must have been in like 5th grade. I said, so where are you on the mood meter today? He goes, I'm all over the mood meter. And then the teacher looked at me, she's like, oh, he's like, you know, one of those troublemakers. And then, you know, I said, well, tell me more. And so he knew we were videotaping the lesson that day because they had to sign the consent form. Anyhow, so he said, well, you know, I woke up in the morning excited in the yellow because I knew I was going to be on TV. And then I was doing my hair and I missed the bus. And I was in the blue because I was so upset. And then my mother yelled at me and I was in the red. And now I'm feeling in the green because I'm here and I missed it, I didn't miss it. I was thinking, this kid's a genius. This kid is so self-aware. He was aware that he had all those different emotions, you know, either simultaneously or sequentially. So we rarely ever experience one emotion. I think the best example that I have is because I travel a lot. you're traveling and your luggage gets lost. And you're like, oh shit, right? I'm supposed to give a talk in the morning. I have nothing to wear. Oh God, all my toiletries are in there. What am I gonna do with like self-care? Oh shit, that book I was reading is in there. Oh no, this is in there. And you're angry, you're frustrated, you're overwhelmed, you're nervous. That's life. So we experience more than one emotion at a time. Okay, so lots of good questions, and I'm just gonna move forward right now. I like this, by the way. Take a look at this cartoon. I don't know if you can see it clearly. So people have asked, like, is the skill of emotion perception declining because of social media or being on our phones all the time? And there is some beginning evidence to suggest that we do kind of lose these skills a little bit when we don't use them as much. One cute study was done in a summer camp where kids were given their technology or not, and they tracked their emotion perception skills over the course of the camp. And what they found was at the end, the students or the children who were in the group where there was no technology actually were more skilled at reading facial expressions. So yes, we need to be careful, and we need to actually be in relationship with each other. So defining this, identifying emotion in oneself and others by interpreting facial expressions, body language, vocal tones, thoughts, physiology, and context. So lots of things that come into play when we're reading emotions. So we're gonna try it. Are you ready, everybody? Can you all see me okay? Thumbs up if you can see me all right. Okay, so here we go. I am gonna display an emotion, and you are all gonna guess what that feeling is. You can do this here on Zoom or on Facebook. All right, here we go. Okay, what do you see? Bored, perplexed, content, frustrated, disappointed. Oh, well, you again, unimpressed, disappointed, sullen, worried, social anxiety, curious, sad, attentive, annoyed, engaged, wow, quizzical. All right, let's stop there. I don't even know where to begin with this. So let's think about this. I just displayed one facial expression. That's me right here. And essentially, we got 35 different emotions: withdrawn, disappointed, impatient, bored, confused, sad, proud, attentive, engaged, resigned, quizzical. So essentially, there was no agreement among hundreds of observers of how I'm feeling. Or maybe clumps of agreement. So firstly, just looking at the responses in terms of what people said. What's up with that? What does this exercise teach us about emotion perception? What's your takeaway right away just from that exercise? We misread people all the time, right? We perceive emotions differently, need more practice. We all interpret facial expressions differently. All right, so let's pause for a minute. Let me tell you what I was trying to show. What I was trying to show was curiosity. So now, you know, Matt is on our research team. Like, I'm in a meeting with Matt and the other 25 researchers, and I'm like trying to look curious, and everybody's thinking like, why is Mark pissed off? He seems disappointed in our research. Like, is this like that bad of a presentation? So think about the ramifications, right, of this work. think about the ramifications of misreading emotion. What are the implications? What are the implications here? Misunderstanding, assumptions, to disaster, misattunement, judgment. Yeah. So when you think about this now in the context of parents and kids, in the workplace, in classrooms, I mean, you just realize how often we are misidentifying or interpreting or perceiving other people's emotions. And so there's some takeaways here, right? Some simple takeaways. One, we don't always know how people are reading us, because if I didn't ask you, right, think about that. If I didn't ask you to tell me, you would just observe this facial expression and then you would make a story, right? You're making a story about what you're seeing. Mark is disinterested. Mark is irritated. Mark is annoyed. You have no clue, really, how I'm feeling. Not all emotions are created equal. So if I were to do like this, how am I feeling? Surprised, right? That's an easy one. But none of us really walk around the world, you know, making, like, when we feel disgusted at somebody in a meeting, we don't go like this, ew. Like, nobody does that, right? You just do this little weird little, like, huh, little crunch of the nose, or the contempt is like that little thing here. We're much more subtle, right? Because we don't want to get caught necessarily. Right? How well we know a person, right? If you were my partner, my child, my brother, maybe you would be more accurate. And I think the big thing here is speculation. Like, we want to be really careful to not speculate. So with that said, it brings up questions, right? Are we picking up broadcasts, or are we attributing emotions to the sender? How can you know if we're making the right attribution? If you ask me, I might say I'm feeling content. You don't believe me. So that's complicated, right? And there are these different kinds of errors that we make when we are interpreting emotions of other people. One is, we call it realism. What is that? Well, it's believing you see things as they really are, that a person's emotions is as you experiencing them. Like, if I laugh at a joke, the person is funny. But that's based on my own perception, right? I could also be crying to be manipulative. Anyone ever see that before? Or there's idealism, seeing things as we expect them to be. Mark, you're angry, but you just don't know it. I get that all the time. Well, I don't get that all the time, but I hear that all the time. Or, I have an aunt who's like, what's wrong? I'm like, you. I'm fine. You're projecting. Like, that's you projecting your stuff onto me. It's not me. So I want to introduce Matt now as my first guest. And Matt, do you want to just do a quick intro?
Yes, thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Matthew LaPalme, and I'm Associate Research Scientist at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And my research primarily focuses on emotion perception and emotion regulation. So the ways people can perceive emotions others are expressing and how they regulate their own emotions.
Cool. So Matt, tell us a little bit about, you've been working for a while, actually 3 years, on this emotion perception test. And tell us, like, about the measurement of emotion perception, like some of the things that you saw me talk about. Like, what is that? What comes up for you as I've been sharing the science around this?
Yeah, so the thing that I think of most is emotions are messy, and it's difficult to think of them as one thing. People have different ways of expressing them, and there's different sources of the messiness. So some of the sources of the messiness could be, Mark, maybe your curiosity looks a little bit like boredom, and that's an individual difference. But another source of messiness could be cultural differences. People express emotions in different ways across different cultures. And one of the ways that we focused on reducing the messiness in our test was to think about the potential for like-me biases. So one of the consistent sources of variance in the way people perceive emotions that research shows is people are better able to recognize emotions for people who are more similar to themselves. So what that means is that, for example, Mark, you would be better able to recognize the expressions of another white person, and maybe less able to recognize the emotion expressions of a Black person. And that can lead to potential biases and perceptions in the way we communicate with one another. So that was one of the things our center really focused on, trying to measure and unpack in terms of emotion perception.
So what do we know about some of the potential racial biases in emotion perception? What does the research show in that space?
Yeah, so before we jump into the emotions, I think we have to first just acknowledge that facial perception is different. Not even at the point of, labeling. It's more difficult to recognize faces of different races than your own. It takes you longer to recognize faces of different others.
Mm-hmm.
And when you process those facial features, you're more likely to make misattributions. And there's a couple of current events or relevant examples that are relevant for current events. For example, police officers are more likely to attribute hostile emotions to people of color and to appraise a person of color as being threatening. And that goes to a deep unconscious bias that people have when they perceive the faces of different others. We can have unconscious associations between people who are different than us and the emotions they feel.
Yeah, so what people are saying is it sounds like a prejudice or like you said, an unconscious bias. And so the way I think of it is like living in the world, right? We hear things, we learn things from being in our culture around race, around gender, and those become sort of they're like printed in our brains. And then what you're saying is that when I'm going to look at let's say a neutral, like a Black male displaying a neutral expression, I'm going to potentially project slightly more negativity to that expression than I would to a white male.
Yes. So someone in the chat, said, surely you mean white police officers. And I think this is an important point. Unconscious biases are universal. These occur in every individual. And the reason that is to your point, Mark, is they're learned. The people that are around you, you're going to be better able to recognize their faces and their expressions. So if you grew up in a white family, obviously you'll be able to better recognize white faces. If you grew up in a Black family, you'd be better able to recognize Black faces. So that bias can get programmed across different individuals. One of the curious things, however, that we find in our country is people actually are better able to recognize emotion expressions for the majority group. And I have, there's a couple hypotheses as you can think why. There's more examples of white faces in TVs and movies all around us, and they are the majority group. So the point I'd like to drive home is that, unconscious bias is something that we all have to think about, not just white people.
Thank you. Any other thoughts you have around what would you recommend to people that would potentially want to reduce this bias?
So the first step, I think, is recognizing that you can have unconscious associations. And there's a great teaching tool if you're curious to know more about unconscious associations, and called the implicit association task from Harvard. And they have some great resources around that, which I love to give to my students to get them thinking about that conversation.
Matt, one quick thing about that, is that Mahzarin Banaji, who's the professor who developed that at Yale. Just want to put that out there now.
Yes, very happy to plug my university now. And I think that's a great, conversation piece that you can take yourself. It's something you can do on the computer for 10 minutes. And what that test shows you is that, there are these unconscious associations you'll have between either positive or negatively valenced words and people who look different from you. And it's not just race. They also have IAT tasks for gay people in all sorts of different minority groups. And once you start to think about that, those unconscious associations, you can start to unpack them. So, label it to tame it.
Cool. Thank you so much. I think I'm also hearing though that like as a teacher or as a leader of a center or as a parent, anyone, is that like take that pause before you make the attribution. Like check in, like, and don't go right for what everybody else did with my facial expression, right? You're angry, you're disappointed, you're this, because that's like coming from that guttural, potentially unconscious space. And like take that pause, take that breath, say, okay, wait a minute, am I projecting this feeling to this person, onto this person, or is this how they're feeling, or do I need to ask to get a lot of clarity? Does that resonate?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing we were trying to do or will do in developing our research around perception is to try to see if people have sort of measurable differences in the way they have like rose-colored glasses, for example. When I tend to perceive others' emotions, I tend to focus on the negative aspects of what they're feeling or expressing. So I tend to attribute others' expressions to more negative feelings. And that's a bias I have. I project that onto others. So you have to think about, well, how is my perception being led by what I'm feeling or what I'm attending to in terms of, the signals they're sending me?
Cool. You're reminding me, so many years ago, I was coaching a leader of an education authority in England. And this woman took our earlier test of emotion perception, and she had a very high score in negativity bias that she kind of identified. Like if it was angry, it was enraged. If it was happy, it was just calm. Like everything was skewed, down the positive and up the negative. Long story short is that we happened to have this dinner, and we're sitting at this dinner, and you have dinner with Mark, you have to do like your little storytelling. So I'm like, where do you live on the mood meter? And long story short is that my friend Claire was there, who is like the happiest person I know. And Claire said, well, I'm like yellow. And the woman said, really? I don't see you as like someone like that. And I said, like, I'm green. And she's like, green? You're kind of blue to me. And so essentially within like 5 minutes, like she made everyone feel bad about themselves, right? And essentially had a negativity bias. And so when we were leaving their dinner, I said, hey, blank, blank, did you notice at the dinner table, that no matter what anyone said about how they were feeling, you had this kind of like, you found a way to make it more negative? It was such a wake-up call. So that's also part of being able to get feedback, right? Which can be hard.
Yeah. There's nothing worse than that coworker who comes in and says to you, why are you so upset?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not upset. So
yeah, cool. Matt, thank you for showing up tonight. Really appreciate it. You can stay on, or if you have to go do more research.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Really fun to have you. So, as Matt said, right, we have these implicit biases or unconscious biases that can impact, the way we are interpreting emotions. So we're going to get to some solutions in a minute, but I have another guest. I think they're here. Are you here, Damien? Just want to see if he's coming on.
Yeah, put your video back on.
Come on, give us your video.
Mark, I'm here. Can you hear me? They
have to allow the video.
Okay, so Bonnie, can you give Damien his video back, please? We're gonna work on that.
Okay,
right, Damien, got the request.
There you go. Okay, cool. So before we get to our solutions, I have another guest, actually two guests, Damien Tallulah. And I was actually speaking with Damien today about this particular book club night around emotion perception, and he shared a really cool story with me around being a father who was misreading his own kid and some of what it made him feel like. So Damien, do you mind sharing that?
Sure. I was sharing with you this morning. All my kids are teenagers now, but I remember, even now and throughout their childhood, I really like taking their pictures on many, many occasions and capturing their moment. And my middle child, Sage, he has a little bit of a dimple on one side. And I remember on many occasions, I thought that he wasn't smiling for the family photo. And I would be like, because it was kind of a crooked smile. And I thought he was I thought he was just being rude or like, a little wise Alec. And I would be like, come on, just smile. And I had this really negative reaction to what I thought was him being a little wise guy. And I can't remember how many times I really reacted in a negative way and really was mean to him. I was like, come on, just smile, like just for a second, and and when I found out, like, from really looking at a picture in a more relaxed moment and saying to his siblings and himself, saying, oh, that's your smile? Like, oh my goodness. Like I felt so awful to have misread that. Never mind also on top of that, compounding it with a reaction and being almost mean-spirited. So I've tried to unpack that with him many times over the years. And luckily, or maybe it's just hasn't revealed, but his feedback is that it didn't impact him as negatively as it made me feel like an awful parent for the time that I was assessing him wrong and being mean in a reaction back to him.
So in retrospect, Damien, like what might you have done differently?
That's a good question. I haven't even thought about that. I think
I can't prepare you for everything for this.
What's that?
I can't have you prepared for this. You got to be spontaneous.
I mean, honestly, like nowadays, I'm trying to slow down and having much more of a curiosity around my just being reactive. And when slowing down my reaction to it and looking at it, it elicits much more of a relationship based on in the moment intimacy versus like he did something wrong. I judged it and then reacted this way. So nowadays it's much more in the moment, curious, and a lot less reaction. So can't say.
You read something called Permission to Feel. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I got so much out of that book, and actually he has a copy that he's digging into, and looking back into it now, the book has really been helpful. And we together actually used a mood meter, so that's an interesting tool that he
Cool.
Yeah.
It reminds me, as a kid, I was bullied a lot and I hated school, and my father put me into karate because he said it was going to make me a tough guy, which, as you can see, it worked, really well. I am tough, by the way. I just don't, we're not going to get into that tonight. Anyhow, I go to karate. I fail my freaking yellow book test. I wrote about this, and I come home and I'm yelling, I hate you. I'm never going to karate again. And what happened is, I triggered my mother, right? Because I'm yelling at her, I hate you, right? So what happens? She is not the emotion scientist who is saying, honey, it sounds like you've had a really rough day. She's like, get to your room. Who do you think you are talking to me that way? And you can see how this misperception, mine was kind of being aggressive and angry, leads to complete miscommunication, kids going into denial about their feelings, suppressing feelings. That's what I did. I ate my feelings, suppressed my feelings, denied my feelings. And I learned very early, I can't trust my parents. They're not going to really, they're not going to even ask. They never even asked me how I felt.
I think that's a good story. I remember just hearing that again when we were listening to the book again today. It's heartbreaking, and it really broke my heart to be mean to my child. And it's such a useful tool now to look behind the upset. And I can't even tell you how grateful I am to like have that resource to try to understand what's going on behind his upset, because the alternative is it's not just heartbreaking, but it's really damaging to both of us.
in a relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't really, because then it becomes, there is no relationship basically in terms of, you know, in my case, it was, I'm not going to tell, you know, I don't, first I didn't know how to communicate how I was feeling. So there you go there. So that was why was it my job as the child to figure out how to communicate my shame and fear and disgust to the adult who was raising me and teaching me.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another message for tonight, for the parents that are listening and watching, is that as the adults who are raising and teaching kids, we have to be the role models, which means that we've got to check in with our biases, our attributions. We've got to take that breath before we make that you know, assumption about how someone is feeling, and maybe, just maybe, ask the person how they're feeling.
Yeah.
And then you have to listen to what they say.
One of the things that I'll add is that, you know, I thought of a recent scenario where he was fighting with his sister, and I was trying to separate them. And I just wanted to add the part from where it's like, it's so important to be like persistent with them. And just, I didn't have the right words. I didn't know how to express my own feelings of my own reaction, how awful I was feeling about them fighting, and couldn't get to the bottom of where he was at. And I just kept being persistent with him, saying, I care about you. I want to resolve this. I'll do what it takes. The whole night was, you know, terrible. And then the next morning he came back and he was ready for my love and attention. And I was like, whew. The whole night went by, and it was working. It worked out. Yeah, you remember that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this is cool. Thank you for sharing. I
Yeah.
want to wrap up today because we are running out of time with just some basic solutions for everybody. I think the first is like self-awareness. Like the goal of much of this work and emotion perception and understanding is self-awareness, right? We may not change our gut reactions, but we can realize the attributions we're making. Also realize other biases include that, you know, I'm a victim of this. I have an argument with my partner at home. I'm like perseverating it in the car on the way to work. I get to work, and then I'm like, what's wrong? To somebody else. They're like, I don't have the, you know, I don't have the, you know, whatever, I'm reactive. And it's I'm completely unaware, you know, that I am projecting my feelings about what happened there to the next situation. So that's another example of pausing to label feelings to then attribute them to their cause. So they have lesser an influence on future outcomes. Remember that you are perceiving something about them, right? Not you. Past experiences, which can bias perceptions, but to be aware of that. And we often want someone to feel a certain way, like everything's fine. You ever see, anybody ever said, it's gonna be fine. Like, and you just basically dismiss the true feeling. Context really matters. So really making sure you understand the contextual information, acquire more emotion knowledge, hence why we're having this book club, you know, understand the cultural differences. I think for me, I've had the privilege of traveling around the world a lot, and eye gaze, for example, you know, doesn't mean the same thing here as it does in Korea, where I studied my martial art. And I was sharing today in another presentation that, you know, you can get really neurotic about this and start like doing weird behaviors when you're interacting with people, or because of your own cultural bias, you say things like, why are you being so disrespectful, right? I had a teacher here in Connecticut who was from Chile, and she said to me, my superintendent is yelling at me to like look him in the eye. And she said, like, it's not what I was grown up to do. And she's like, I don't know how to communicate this problem. But it's a great example, I think, of how we go in with assumptions that, you know, American values, eye contact, strong handshake means whatever it means, but that other ways are wrong. And so we want to really work on eliminating that mindset, right? The American way is the right way. And very interestingly, when you think about this, and we're going to talk about this next time, the greater your vocabulary is for emotion, the more granular, so I swallow my L's and R's a lot. the better you are, or the more advanced your emotion vocabulary is, right? When you have a lot of words for anger, peeved, irritated, angry, enraged, or a lot of words for the happiness family, you start noticing and you start differentiating emotions in other people in more eloquent ways. So that's going to be the wrap up for today. Let's just pause and just get comfortable in our seats to do some digesting. And for our last couple of minutes, I'll take 2 or 3 questions that can come in. What are you thinking about as a result of this book club week 3, emotion, perception, understanding? So some people are asking, how do you manage it in the heat of the moment, right? It's like, we all know this, don't make decisions when you're highly activated. You've got to find a way to deactivate first. So we're gonna get there in emotion regulation. And this is what's interesting about the ruler skills, is that it's not like you always go from R to U to L to E to R. Sometimes you gotta do the last R to get to the first R. Just unfortunately, you gotta present these things in a sequential way to teach them and learn them. Matt, they're curious about your research. So Matt has been working on this huge paper on emotion perception that we're finalizing this summer, and we'll be happy to share that with you at some point. Some people are asking about the advice around the intersection of emotional intelligence and people who are on the autism spectrum disorder. I've actually just written a paper on that, which I probably can share that in some form or another. I collaborated with the leading expert at Yale, and he and I together wrote a paper that brings together the intersection of these 2 concepts. All right, so remember, be an emotion scientist, not an emotion judge. Your homework for this week is to be socially aware, right? You've been self-aware for a while now. Now your goal over the weekend, over next week, is to start looking around. And it was very fun. I'm reminded of a training that I did in New York City many years ago. And a woman said, you know, I walk around like this. I don't really look at people. And she goes, I set my goal and my intention that when I get out the subway, I'm gonna like look up and look at people and see how they respond to my facial expressions. And she came in like, oh my God, I looked at this police officer and then it got uncomfortable. And then I looked at this person, and it just was just a kind of a new exposure to seeing the world in a different way. So I encourage you all to just put on your social perception lens. And remember, next week, we're gonna go more into labeling and then expressing and regulating. And until then, have a hopefully peaceful break from work. And I look forward to seeing you all next Thursday. Bye-bye. Thank you.